The silence in the Senate chamber was the kind that makes people hold their breath. Not the comfortable silence of agreement, but the tense, suffocating silence that comes right before something explosive happens. Maxine Waters sat at the witness table, her designer suit catching the harsh overhead lights, her expression carefully composed into that practiced look of righteous authority she'd perfected over 33 years in Congress. She had her notes arranged just so, her water glass positioned within easy reach, her team of attorneys flanking her like bodyguards. She was ready for questions. She was ready for pushback. She was ready for partisan attacks. What she wasn't ready for was Senator John Kennedy from Louisiana, who sat across from her looking like someone's grandfather who'd wandered in by mistake, his reading glasses perched at an odd angle, his legal pad covered in handwritten notes, his southern drawl about to become the instrument of her complete destruction. Because Kennedy hadn't come to ask questions. He'd come with receipts, not allegations, not rumors, not partisan talking points, actual receipts, documents, financial records, ethics reports, FEC filings, transcripts, video footage, a folder so thick it could double as a weapon, and he was about to use every single page of it to systematically dismantle 33 years of corruption, incompetence, and family enrichment that Maxine Waters thought she'd gotten away with. This wasn't going to be a hearing. This was going to be a prosecution. And Maxine Waters was about to learn what accountability actually means. Waters arrived that morning with confidence. The kind of confidence that comes from surviving in Washington for over 3 decades without facing real consequences. She'd weathered ethics investigations. She'd survived scandal after scandal. She'd built a media brand as a fighter, a resistor, someone who spoke truth to power. Her supporters loved her. The liberal media protected her. Her colleagues feared crossing her. She chaired the House Financial Services Committee, one of the most powerful positions in Congress. She controlled legislation affecting trillions of dollars. She had seniority, power, connections, and the armor of someone who'd learned that in Washington, the rules don't apply equally. So when she walked into that Senate chamber, she expected what she always got: softball questions from Democrats, predictable attacks from Republicans that she could deflect with accusations of racism, a few sound bites for the evening news, then back to business as usual. What she got instead was Kennedy, and Kennedy had done his homework. The hearing was ostensibly about banking regulation and financial oversight, Waters' supposed area of expertise. She'd been invited to discuss accountability in the financial sector, to explain her committee's work, to defend her legislative priorities. Standard congressional theater, but Kennedy had turned it into something else entirely. He'd spent months preparing, not hours, months. His staff had pulled every public record available, every FEC filing, every ethics complaint, every financial disclosure, every earmark, every campaign expenditure, every property record, every speech, every interview, every vote. They'd created timelines, cross-referenced data, verified sources, built an airtight case. And Kennedy had memorized all of it, not just read it, memorized it. So when he started asking questions, he didn't need to look at notes. He could cite numbers, dates, amounts, and documents from memory while maintaining eye contact with Waters, making it personal, making it devastating. The opening was deceptively gentle. Kennedy waited until Waters finished her prepared remarks about holding financial institutions accountable, let the applause die down, took off his reading glasses, cleaned them slowly with his tie, put them back on, looked at her with that smile that seems friendly until you realize it's the expression a predator gets right before the kill. Then he started talking in that slow Louisiana drawl that makes every word sound like it's being served with sweet tea and a side of absolutely devastating truth. "Congresswoman Waters," he began, "that was a beautiful speech, truly moving. You talk about accountability like you invented the concept, which is interesting because I've been doing some research on accountability, specifically on whether you've had any." The room shifted. That wasn't the script. Democrats on the committee looked up from their phones. Republicans leaned forward. Waters' smile froze on her face like someone had hit pause mid-expression. Kennedy pulled out the folder. It landed on his desk with a thud that echoed through the chamber. A sound that said this isn't going to be a normal hearing. This is going to be something else entirely. "I have some questions," Kennedy continued in that deceptively gentle drawl. About your finances, your district, your family's very lucrative consulting business, and a bank that got $12 million in bailout money right after you made some phone calls. But before we get to all that, he opened the folder with the care of someone handling something distasteful. I want to make sure we're using the same definition of accountability. Because where I'm from, accountability means you're responsible for your actions. You answer for your conduct. You face consequences when you do wrong. Is that the same definition you're using? Just want to make sure we're speaking the same language before we proceed. Waters's attorneys were already whispering frantically. Her staff was signaling her to be careful. Democrats on the committee were wondering where this was going. Republicans were trying not to smile because they could sense blood in the water. And Waters herself was realizing she'd walked into something very different from what she'd expected. Kennedy wasn't some backwoods lawyer who'd be impressed by her credentials and intimidated by her righteous indignation. He was a former trial attorney with decades of experience destroying hostile witnesses, and he just declared open season on her entire career. What happened next wasn't a hearing. It was an execution, a methodical, documented, utterly devastating exposure of 33 years of corruption. Kennedy had organized his attack into 8 distinct rounds, each one built on the last, each one more damning than the one before, each one backed by documentation that couldn't be disputed, only defended. And Waters couldn't defend any of it. She could deflect. She could accuse. She could invoke racism and partisanship and victimhood. But she couldn't dispute the facts, because Kennedy had receipts for everything. Round 1 was the bank bailout, the One United Bank scandal that the House Ethics Committee had investigated and then quietly swept under the rug. Kennedy pulled it back out into the light, made it impossible to ignore. He had the timeline. September 2008, financial crisis, banks failing, TARP funds being distributed. And Maxine Waters' husband, Sidney Williams, owned at least $250,000 in One United Bank stock. Stock that would become worthless if the bank failed, which it was about to do. Bad investments, poor management, the usual problems that sink small banks. Except One United didn't sink, because Waters made some phone calls. Kennedy laid it out with brutal precision. You personally called Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson, he said, holding up phone records. You, the congresswoman whose husband owned $250,000 in One United stock, called the Treasury Secretary to discuss One United Bank. Then you arranged a meeting between Treasury officials and One United executives. Kennedy pulled out more documents, emails, meeting notes, testimony from Treasury officials who'd felt the meeting was inappropriate, who'd said it was unusual, who'd described it as special treatment. But the meeting happened anyway. And guess what? One United received $12 million in TARP funds, taxpayer money, money that saved the bank, money that saved Waters' husband's investment, money that came after Waters personally intervened using her position as a member of Congress. Kennedy let that sink in. Then he pulled out the House Ethics Committee report, the one that found Waters had violated House rules by bringing a matter before the government in which she had a personal financial interest. The literal definition of corruption. The report that resulted in Waters being admonished, not fined, not censured, not expelled, just told don't do it again and try to be less obvious next time. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Kennedy said with exaggerated confusion. In 2008, when banks were failing and people were losing their homes and their life savings, you used your position as a member of Congress to arrange a $12 million taxpayer-funded bailout for a bank where your husband had invested $250,000. You personally benefited. Your family's finances were protected, and your punishment was being told that was naughty. He cleaned his glasses again, slowly, letting the silence build. Congresswoman, if I owned stock in a bank and used my Senate position to get that bank bailout money, I'd be in federal prison. Martha Stewart went to prison for insider trading involving $45,000. Your family benefited from a $12 million bailout you arranged, but you got admonished. Kennedy put his glasses back on. That's not accountability. That's the opposite of accountability. That's Washington protecting its own. And you're still here, still chairing the committee that oversees banks, still lecturing people about financial ethics. The irony is so thick I'm choking on it. Waters tried to defend herself. I was helping a minority-owned bank serve the community. Kennedy didn't let her finish. You were helping your husband's stock portfolio, he said flatly. The community got $12 million in taxpayer debt. Your husband got to keep his investment, some service. The taxpayers bailed out your family's bad investment. And you call it public service, ma'am. That's not public service. That's public theft with a better PR strategy. Round one complete. Waters already looked shaken, but Kennedy was just getting started. He had 7 more rounds loaded and ready to fire. Round two was family enrichment. Specifically, Corinne Waters, Maxine's daughter, the political consultant who'd made over $1.2 million from her mother's campaigns over 20 years. Kennedy pulled out the FEC reports, spread them across his desk like a poker player revealing a royal flush. Corinne runs a company that does slate mailers, he explained. You know what those are? They're basically flyers that tell voters who to vote for. Any print shop can make them. They cost about $5,000 to $10,000 for a typical campaign. Kennedy looked up over his reading glasses. Your campaign pays Corinne's company about $75,000 to $150,000 per election cycle for slate mailers. That's 10 to 15 times the market rate. He let that number hang in the air. Then he pulled out more reports, covering multiple election cycles. Since 2004, your campaign has paid Corinne over $1.2 million. $1.2 million for services that should cost maybe $100,000 total over that entire period. She's been paid 10 times what the services are worth. Kennedy's voice carried genuine bewilderment. Now, I'm just a simple country lawyer, but even I can do that math. You're paying your daughter 10 times market rate using donor money and campaign funds. That's quite the family business model. But it wasn't just Maxine's campaigns. Other politicians paid Corinne too. Politicians who wanted Maxine's endorsement. Politicians who needed her support. Politicians who understood that the way to Maxine's heart was through Corinne's bank account. Kennedy read from a list. In 2020, your campaign paid Corinne $250,000. Other campaigns she worked on, all campaigns that received your endorsement, paid her similar amounts. The pattern is clear. Hire Corinne, get Maxine's support. Don't hire Corinne, good luck getting Maxine's help. He sat down the list and looked at Waters with theatrical seriousness. Ma'am, you've created a pay-to-play scheme using your daughter as the middle woman. Politicians who want your support hire your daughter at inflated rates. Your daughter gets rich. You maintain plausible deniability by saying you don't control who hires her, and the political establishment gets to funnel money to your family in exchange for your influence. Waters started to respond. Kennedy rolled over her like a Louisiana flood. The FEC allows family members to work for campaigns. That's legal. But paying them 10 times market rate, that's converting campaign funds for personal family benefit. That's using your political position to enrich your family. And you've been doing it for 20 years. He pulled out one more document. This is an analysis by a campaign finance watchdog group. They calculated that if Corinne had been paid market rates for her services, she would have made about $150,000 over the past 20 years. Instead, she's made over $1 million. That's $850,000 in excess payments to your daughter. That's not consulting fees. That's tribute paid to your family for access to your power. Kennedy leaned forward. Your daughter charges 15 times what a print shop charges for the same service. The only thing that justifies that premium is her last name. She's not selling consulting services. She's selling access to you. And you're allowing it because your family profits. Congresswoman, you've turned your political position into a family ATM. Your daughter gets rich. You keep power. Donors and taxpayers fund it all. And you call it legitimate business. Ma'am, the only thing legitimate about it is that you've technically stayed within loopholes that you and your colleagues created to enrich yourselves. Waters was shaking her head. My daughter provides valuable consulting services. At 15 times market rate. Kennedy's voice went up. Congresswoman, I've run campaigns. I know what slate mailers cost. I know what consultants charge. Your daughter's rates are absurd, unless the service she's really providing is access to you. That's not consulting. That's money laundering your political influence through your daughter's LLC. 2 rounds in, Waters was getting defensive. Her carefully practiced composure was cracking. Her attorneys were furiously taking notes. Democrats on the committee were staring at their desks, unwilling to defend the indefensible. Republicans were leaning back with satisfied expressions. And Kennedy was just warming up. Round 3 was the district. The constituents Waters claimed to represent. The people she'd promised to fight for when she was first elected in 1991. Kennedy pulled out a map, charts, statistics, data that told a story of absolute failure. Congresswoman, you've represented California's 43rd congressional district since 1991. That's 33 years, a third of a century, an entire generation. Let's talk about how that district is doing under your leadership. He held up the map. California's 43rd includes South Los Angeles, Inglewood, portions of Gardena, and Hawthorne. These are historically African-American communities, working-class families, the people you claim to represent, the people you say you fight for. Kennedy pulled out the statistics, started reading them like a coroner reading a death certificate. In 1991, when you took office, the poverty rate in your district was about 23%. Today, it's 31%. That's not a typo. After 33 years of your representation, poverty has increased by 8 percentage points. More people are poor now than when you started. He didn't stop there. Median household income in your district, $45,000. Know what the California state average is, $84,000. Your constituents make about half what other Californians make. Crime rate, among the highest in the state. High school graduation rate, among the lowest. Homelessness exploded under your tenure. Kennedy sat down the statistics and pulled out photos. But you're not suffering, are you? This is your house. $4.5 million in Hancock Park. Beautiful place. 6 bedrooms, 7 bathrooms, pool, the works, very nice. He held up the photo so everyone could see. Hancock Park. That's one of the wealthiest neighborhoods in Los Angeles. Average home price about $3 million. It's where old money lives. Gated streets, private security. Not a lot of crime in Hancock Park. Kennedy pulled out a map, pointed. Here's the interesting part. Hancock Park is not in your district. You represent South Los Angeles, but you don't live there. You live in one of the richest neighborhoods in LA while representing some of the poorest people in California. You drive past homeless encampments on your way from your mansion to your office. He looked at Waters with genuine curiosity. When did you move out of the district? Was it gradual? Did you wake up one day and think, I've done such a great job representing these people that I deserve to live somewhere nicer? Or did you always plan to get rich off the position and move out as soon as you could afford it? Waters tried to speak. Kennedy held up a hand. I'm genuinely asking because I've been a senator for 8 years and I still live in Louisiana. Not in the fancy part. In the same house I lived in before I was elected. I shop at the same grocery stores as my constituents. I see them at church. I live among the people I represent because that's what representation means. He pointed at the mansion photo again. But you live in a $4.5 million mansion in a neighborhood your constituents can't even afford to drive through. On a salary of $174,000 a year. You've been in Congress for 33 years. Even with perfect saving and no expenses, you couldn't afford that house on your salary. So where did the money come from? Kennedy pulled out financial disclosure forms. Your net worth is estimated between $2 and $6 million. Your salary is $174. Your husband is retired. Your daughter is a consultant, but her income is her own. So how did you accumulate millions? He answered his own question. Stock trading, speaking fees, book deals, consulting fees. All the ways politicians turn public service into private profit. You've spent 33 years monetizing your congressional seat while your constituents got poorer. Kennedy's voice got harder now. You've represented South Los Angeles for 33 years. In that time, poverty increased, crime increased, homelessness exploded, graduation rates dropped. Every single metric of success has gotten worse, but you got richer, you got more powerful, you bought a mansion outside your district. He gathered the statistics back into a pile. Ma'am, that's not representation, that's extraction. You've extracted wealth from your position while extracting nothing but misery for your constituents. After 33 years, if your district is worse off, that's not bad luck. That's not Republican obstruction. That's not systemic racism. That's your leadership failure. Waters was visibly angry now. I've fought for my district for decades, And they've gotten poorer while you've gotten richer, Kennedy interrupted. After 33 years, the results speak for themselves. You don't even live there anymore. You represent South LA from a mansion in Hancock Park. That tells your constituents everything they need to know about your priorities. They're not in Hancock Park. 3 rounds complete. 3 devastating exposures of corruption, family enrichment, and constituent abandonment. And Kennedy had 5 more rounds coming. The chamber was completely silent now. Everyone watching. Everyone waiting. Everyone wondering how much worse it could get for Waters. The answer was much worse. Round 4 was the obsession. The impeachment obsession that had defined Waters' entire time during the Trump presidency. Kennedy pulled out what looked like a complete transcript collection. Thick stacks of paper held together with binder clips. He hefted them with exaggerated effort. Congresswoman, you've been very vocal about impeachment over the years. Very passionate, some might say obsessed. Let me share some numbers with you. He opened the first transcript. March 2017. 2 months after President Trump took office, you called for his impeachment. Here's the quote: he should be impeached. No investigation yet. No evidence. Just your opinion that he should be impeached. Kennedy flipped through more transcripts. April 2017 called for impeachment. May 2017 called for impeachment. You were on CNN, MSNBC, anywhere that would have you, saying impeach 45. You said it so often it became your catchphrase. You had supporters making signs with it. You were the impeachment lady. He pulled out a tally sheet. I had my staff count. Between January 2017 and December 2020, you called for President Trump's impeachment on television or in public statements 28 times. 28. That's 7 times a year, once every 7 weeks. You were more consistent about calling for impeachment than most people are about going to church. Kennedy set down the transcripts. Now, here's what interests me. During those 4 years when you were obsessed with impeachment, what were you doing for your district? What bills did you pass to help South Los Angeles? What legislation did you sponsor to reduce poverty or crime? He pulled out her legislative record. Let me read this. Bills passed to directly help your district during the Trump years, 0. Committee hearings held in your district to address local concerns, 0. Federal funding secured specifically for South LA, minimal. But TV appearances calling for impeachment, dozens. Kennedy looked up. You spent 4 years trying to remove a president instead of helping your constituents. While you were on MSNBC saying impeach, homelessness in Los Angeles was exploding. While you were on CNN demanding investigations, crime in your district was soaring. While you were building your media brand as the resistance fighter, your constituents were suffering. He pulled out more data. During the Trump presidency, homelessness in LA County increased by 63%. 63%. Your district was one of the hardest hit. Did you hold hearings on homelessness? No. Did you propose legislation to address it? No. Were you too busy calling for impeachment? Yes. Waters tried to defend herself. I was holding a lawless president accountable. You were building your media profile, Kennedy said flatly. You were getting FaceTime on cable news. You were becoming a hashtag and a meme. You were doing everything except your actual job, which is representing the people of South Los Angeles. He leaned forward. Congresswoman, your constituents didn't elect you to be a cable news pundit. They didn't elect you to get in Twitter fights with the president. They elected you to represent their interests in Congress, to pass legislation, to secure funding, to make their lives better. But you gave them impeachment speeches. Kennedy pulled out polling data. Here's what your constituents think. In a 2020 poll, 68% of your district said homelessness was their top concern. Know what percentage said impeaching Trump was their top concern? 14%. But you spent all your time on the 14% issue because it got you on TV. He sat down the poll. You weren't serving your constituents. You were serving your ego. You were serving your political brand. You were serving every interest except the people who elected you. And they kept getting poorer while you kept getting more famous. Kennedy's voice was sharp now. After 33 years in Congress, your legacy should be what you built for your district. Instead, your legacy is impeach 45 and a mansion in Hancock Park. That's not public service. That's public performance at the expense of the people you're supposed to serve. 4 rounds of destruction. Waters looking rattled. Her confidence gone. Her composure shattered. Her carefully constructed image of a fighter for the people revealed as a fraud, and Kennedy had 4 more rounds coming. Round 5 was rhetoric, dangerous rhetoric, the kind of inflammatory language that incites violence and then hides behind First Amendment protections. Kennedy's expression changed. This wasn't about corruption or incompetence anymore. This was personal, and his voice carried an edge it hadn't had before. "Congresswoman, let's talk about your rhetoric. You're very passionate when you speak. Some might say inflammatory. Some might say you've crossed the line from passionate to dangerous." He pulled out video footage, queued it up on the monitors in the chamber. April 2021. Brooklyn Center, Minnesota. Derek Chauvin trial. You flew there during the trial, which judges generally don't like, and you spoke to protesters. Here's what you said. The video played. Waters' voice clear and unmistakable. "We've got to stay on the street. We've got to get more confrontational. We've got to make sure they know we mean business." Kennedy paused the video. "Get more confrontational. That was your advice to protesters during an active trial in a city already on edge. The judge in the case said your comments could cause a mistrial. Let me read his exact words. A congresswoman's statement may place the trial in jeopardy. The judge considered declaring a mistrial because of your rhetoric." He pulled out news reports from that night. "After your comments, protests became more violent, more property damage, more injuries, more chaos. You lit a match and then left. You flew back to California and let Brooklyn Center deal with the fire." Kennedy pulled out older footage. "But that's not your first time inciting people to action." June 2018. Here's what you said about Trump administration officials. The video played again. Waters' voice. "If you see anybody from that cabinet in a restaurant, in a department store, at a gasoline station, you get out and you create a crowd and you push back on them and you tell them they're not welcome anymore anywhere." Kennedy looked up from the transcript. "You told people to harass government officials, to create crowds, to make them unwelcome anywhere. And you know what? People listened. Sarah Sanders was kicked out of a restaurant. Mitch McConnell was harassed at his home. Ted Cruz was chased out of a restaurant. You gave permission and your supporters acted." He pulled out more examples. "You've called for confrontation. You've encouraged harassment. You've used inflammatory language over and over. And when your words lead to violence or harassment, you never apologize. You never take responsibility. You claim First Amendment protection and move on to the next inflammatory statement." Kennedy leaned back. "But here's the double standard. When Donald Trump said fight like hell on January 6th, you said he incited an insurrection. You voted to impeach him for his rhetoric. You said words matter. You said leaders are responsible for what their supporters do after hearing their words." He pointed at her. "But when you tell people to get confrontational, that's different. When you tell people to harass officials, that's protected speech. When your words lead to violence, that's just passion. Ma'am, you can't have it both ways. Either rhetoric has consequences or it doesn't. Either leaders are responsible for incitement or they're not." Waters was shaking her head. "I have a right to speak passionately about injustice." "You have a right to speak," Kennedy agreed. "You don't have a right to incite violence and harassment. When you tell people to get confrontational and they do, you bear responsibility. When you tell people to harass officials and they do, that's on you. You can't claim victimhood when you're the one giving the orders." He pulled out the January 6th committee report. The January 6th committee spent 2 years investigating Trump's rhetoric. They analyzed his words. They showed how his language led to violence. They held him accountable for incitement, but they never investigated you. They never analyzed your rhetoric. They never held you accountable for telling people to get more confrontational. Why? Because you were on their side politically. Kennedy's voice got harder. "That's not justice. That's partisan prosecution. Trump's rhetoric is incitement, but yours is activism. Trump's words cause violence, but yours are just passionate. You're either both guilty or both innocent. You don't get to hold him to a standard you refuse to meet yourself." He looked directly at Waters. "You're a leader. You have a platform. Your words matter. When you tell people to get confrontational, some of them will. When you tell them to harass officials, some of them will. You can't pretend you don't know that. You're responsible for the consequences of your rhetoric. And so far, you've faced none." 5 rounds complete. Waters looking completely rattled now. Her attorneys frantically whispering. Democrats on the committee avoiding eye contact. Republicans barely containing their satisfaction. and Kennedy still had 3 more rounds to go. Round 6 was appropriations corruption. The way Waters had used her position on the House Appropriations Committee to create a money laundering scheme that funneled taxpayer dollars to her daughter. Kennedy pulled out appropriations bills, thick legislative documents with sections highlighted in yellow. He opened one to a marked page, squinting at the small print. Congresswoman, you sit on the House Appropriations Committee. That's where spending bills originate. That's where earmarks get added. That's where taxpayer money gets directed to specific projects. Very powerful position. Lots of opportunity for, let's call it, creative spending. He looked up over his reading glasses. Let's talk about where some of that money goes. Specifically, let's talk about organizations in your district that receive federal funds and then coincidentally hire your daughter. Kennedy pulled out a flowchart. I made a diagram because I'm a visual learner. Here's how it works. Step 1. You direct a federal earmark to a community organization. Step 2. That organization hires Karen Waters as a consultant. Step 3. Karen gets paid, often with the federal funds you appropriated. Step 4. The organization and its leaders donate to your campaign. Step 5. Repeat. He pointed to specific examples on the chart. 2019, you secured a $1 million earmark for a South LA community development organization. 3 months later, that organization hired Karen for $75,000 in consulting fees. 6 months after that, the organization's board members and their families maxed out donations to your campaign. Total, $48,000. Kennedy moved to another example. 2020, $500,000 earmarked to a housing nonprofit in your district. 2 months later, Karen's company gets a contract for $90,000. 4 months later, the nonprofit's executives and their relatives donate to your campaign. Interesting pattern, isn't it? He pulled out more examples. 2021, $300,000 to a job training program. Karen gets $60,000 in consulting fees. Campaign donations follow. 2022, $400,000 to a youth services organization. Karen gets $50,000, more donations, over and over. The same pattern. Kennedy set down the flowchart and pulled out accounting records. The FBI could investigate this as money laundering. Here's why. Taxpayer funds are appropriated by you. Those funds go to organizations. Those organizations pay your daughter at above market rates. Those organizations then give money back to you via campaign donations. The taxpayer money goes in a circle. Treasury to organization to your daughter to you. Everyone wins except the taxpayers who funded it. He looked at Waters seriously. Ma'am, you've created a money laundering scheme using federal appropriations. It's legal technically because you've written the rules to allow it, but legal and ethical aren't the same thing. You're taking taxpayer money, routing it through nonprofits to your daughter, and getting campaign donations in return. That's corruption by any reasonable definition. Waters tried to defend herself. These are legitimate community organizations doing important work that hire your daughter at inflated rates after you give them federal money. Kennedy interrupted. Congresswoman, here's the test. Would these organizations hire Karen if you weren't their congresswoman? Would they pay her $90,000 for consulting if you hadn't just secured them a $1 million earmark? Or is hiring Karen the price of admission for getting your support? He leaned forward. You've turned federal appropriations into a family enrichment program. Taxpayer money flows to your district. A cut goes to your daughter. Donations flow back to your campaign, and you call it community service. But the community isn't being served. Your family is. You've privatized the profits and socialized the costs. Taxpayers fund it. Your daughter profits. And your constituents see no real benefit. Kennedy pulled out one more document. This is an analysis by a government watchdog group. They tracked every federal earmark you've secured over the past 10 years and cross-referenced it with your daughter's client list. Guess what? 63% of organizations that received your earmarks hired Karen within the following year. 63%. That's not coincidence. That's a system. He set it down with finality. You've institutionalized corruption. You've made it a system, a process, a business model. And because it's technically legal, you face no consequences. But the American people see what you're doing. They understand that you've turned public service into family profit, and they're tired of it. 6 rounds of devastating exposure. Waters looking destroyed, her career crumbling in real time, her reputation in tatters, her corruption laid bare for everyone to see. And Kennedy still had 2 more rounds. Round 7 was incompetence. The fact that Waters chaired the House Financial Services Committee despite not understanding basic economics or banking principles. Kennedy pulled out what looked like a textbook, a basic economics primer. He opened it to a bookmarked page, read for a moment, then looked at Waters with exaggerated confusion. Congresswoman, you chair the House Financial Services Committee. You regulate banks, oversee the Federal Reserve, control financial legislation affecting trillions of dollars. So I assume you understand basic economics and banking principles. He closed the textbook. Let's test that assumption. I'm going to ask you some simple questions, not trick questions, just basic concepts that anyone regulating the financial system should know. Kennedy pulled out his legal pad. First question. What is the current federal funds rate? Just approximately. You don't need to be exact. Waters blinked. The federal funds rate is it's set by the Federal Reserve to control. Kennedy waited. Waters trailed off. You don't know, Kennedy said. It wasn't a question. The single most important interest rate in the American economy. The rate that affects every other rate. And you don't know what it is. Okay, let's try an easier one. He made a note. Can you explain quantitative easing? What is it and how does it work? Waters straightened. Quantitative easing is when the Federal Reserve purchases assets to stimulate the economy by increasing the money supply and lowering interest rates. Kennedy nodded. That's the textbook definition. Now explain how it actually works. What assets? How does buying them increase money supply? What are the risks? Silence. You memorized a definition but don't understand the mechanism, Kennedy observed. Let's try another one. What's the difference between monetary policy and fiscal policy? Waters gave a vague answer about government spending and Fed policy. Kennedy pressed for details. She couldn't provide them. Congresswoman, these aren't complex questions. These are fundamentals. You've been on the Financial Services Committee for 30 years. You've been the chair since 2019. You regulate the most complex financial system in the world. Yet you can't explain basic concepts that any economics undergraduate should know. Kennedy pulled out video footage of Waters questioning bank CEOs during committee hearings. Let's watch some of your questioning. This is you asking J.P. Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon about student loans. The video played. Waters asked a question based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how bank capital requirements work. Dimon politely tried to explain. Waters talked over him, clearly not understanding his answer. Kennedy paused it. You asked a question that showed you don't understand bank capital ratios. Jamie Dimon tried to educate you. You ignored him because you didn't understand his answer. That's dangerous, ma'am. You're regulating industries you don't understand. He played more clips. Waters confusing concepts, asking questions based on false premises, making statements that revealed gaps in knowledge. Each time the bank CEOs or Fed officials tried to politely correct her, each time she plowed ahead regardless. Here's what concerns me, Kennedy said, stopping the video. You've held this position for years. You have staff who should be educating you. You have access to experts, yet you don't seem to have learned the basics. Why? He answered his own question. Because you don't need to understand the subject to wield power over it. You can regulate industries you don't comprehend because your power comes from seniority, not expertise. You've been there long enough that you chair the committee by default, regardless of whether you're qualified. Kennedy pulled out more examples. You've made policy recommendations that economists across the political spectrum say are nonsensical. You've proposed regulations that show fundamental misunderstandings of how markets work. You've questioned Fed officials about things you clearly don't grasp. And you've done all this while controlling legislation that affects trillions of dollars and millions of jobs. He looked at her seriously. Congresswoman, you're steering a ship you don't know how to sail. You're regulating industries you don't understand. You're making policy affecting the entire economy without grasping basic principles. That's not just incompetence, that's dangerous. People's livelihoods depend on you knowing what you're doing. And you clearly don't. Waters was angry now. I don't need to know every technical detail to provide oversight. Yes, you do. Kennedy's voice rose for the first time. You're the chairman. If you don't understand how banks work, how can you regulate them effectively? If you don't understand monetary policy, how can you oversee the Fed? If you don't grasp basic economics, how can you write financial legislation? He stood up, gathering his papers. You've held this position for years through seniority, not merit. You've wielded power over industries you don't comprehend. You've made policy affecting millions of people without understanding the consequences. And you've done it all while enriching yourself and your family. That's not leadership. That's a con job that's lasted 33 years. 7 rounds of complete destruction. Waters was barely holding it together, her face red, her hands shaking, her voice breaking when she tried to respond. Democrats on the committee were looking at their phones, pretending to be somewhere else. Republicans were taking notes, already planning how to use this in campaign ads. The media in the gallery was frantically typing. This was the biggest political story of the year, and Kennedy had one final round. The summary. The comprehensive review of 33 years of failure. Kennedy stood at his position, gathering all the documents he'd presented into one comprehensive pile. It was several inches thick, the accumulated evidence of 3 decades of corruption, incompetence, and self-dealing. He placed his hand on top of it like a lawyer resting his hand on a Bible before taking an oath. Congresswoman Waters, let's review your career. I want to make sure I haven't missed anything important. He pulled out a timeline, unrolled it so cameras could see it. 1991. You're elected to Congress. You're going to represent South Los Angeles, one of America's poorest communities. You promised to fight for them, to be their voice, to make their lives better. How'd that work out? Kennedy walked along the timeline, pointing. 1991 to 2024, 33 years. Let's look at the results. Poverty in your district increased from 23% to 31%. Median income dropped from 60% of the California average to 53%. Crime increased by 47%. High school graduation rate dropped by 11 points. Homelessness exploded by 600%. He looked up. By every measurable metric, your district is worse off now than when you started. Every single one. Education, income, crime, poverty, homelessness, all worse. You've been their representative for a third of a century and they're worse off. Kennedy moved to a different section of the timeline, but you're not worse off. Let's look at your personal trajectory. 1991, you're a middle-class woman. By 2000, you're worth about $500,000. By 2010, you're a millionaire. By 2020, you're worth over $4 million. Your net worth has increased 8-fold while your constituents got poorer. Funny how that works. He pulled out the photo of her mansion again. And you bought this. $4.5 million outside your district in one of LA's wealthiest neighborhoods. While the people you represent live in poverty, you live in luxury. While they deal with crime and homelessness, you live behind gates with security. Kennedy moved to another section. Let's talk about your family. Your daughter Corinne has made over $1.2 million from your campaigns and from organizations that receive your earmarks. Your husband's investment in One United Bank was saved by a $12 million bailout you arranged. Your family has profited immensely from your position. They're much better off than they were in 1991. He pulled out the ethics violations. House Ethics Committee has investigated you multiple times. One United Bank violated House rules. Campaign finance, multiple complaints. Earmark abuses documented but unpunished. You've been admonished but faced no real consequences. You've violated ethics rules repeatedly and remained in power. Kennedy pulled out legislative records. Your legislative accomplishments, minimal. Bills you've passed to help your district, essentially zero. Major legislation with your name on it, none. What have you actually accomplished in 33 years besides enriching yourself and your family? He pulled out media appearances. But you've made time for TV. Hundreds of cable news appearances, thousands of tweets, countless press conferences. You've built a media brand as a fighter, a resistor, a voice for the voiceless. But when we look at actual results, the voiceless are still voiceless. They're just poorer now. Kennedy pulled out the incitement footage. You've used inflammatory rhetoric that's led to violence. You've told people to get confrontational. You've encouraged harassment of officials. You've incited action without taking responsibility for consequences, and you've never apologized. He pulled out the financial ignorance examples. You chair the Financial Services Committee despite not understanding basic economics. You regulate industries you can't comprehend. You ask questions that reveal fundamental gaps in knowledge. You wield power you're not qualified to have. Kennedy gathered everything back into the pile, stood directly in front of Waters. Congresswoman Maxine Waters, 33 years in Congress. Your district is worse off by every metric. Your family is richer by millions. You live in a mansion outside your district. You've violated ethics rules repeatedly. You've enriched your family using your position. You've incited violence with your rhetoric. You don't understand the industries you regulate. You've accomplished nothing legislatively except maintaining your own power. His voice was quiet but carried throughout the silent chamber. You represent everything wrong with career politicians in Washington. You've turned public service into private profit. You've extracted wealth from your position while your constituents extracted nothing but more poverty. You've held power for 3 decades without delivering results. You've enriched your family while families in your district struggle. Kennedy picked up the entire pile of evidence. This is 33 years of corruption, incompetence, and self-dealing, documented in official records, FEC filings, ethics reports, legislative records, and public statements. Every claim I've made today is backed by evidence. Every accusation is proven by your own conduct. He set it back down. The question isn't whether you've been a corrupt, ineffective representative. The evidence proves you have been. The question is, will you finally be held accountable? Will you face consequences for violating ethics rules? Will you face primary challenges from constituents who are tired of being represented by someone who doesn't live among them or understand them? Kennedy looked at the camera. Or will you stay in power, keep enriching your family, keep living in your mansion, keep failing your constituents, keep facing no consequences? Because that's been the pattern for 33 years. And based on history, that pattern will continue until the voters of South Los Angeles decide they deserve better. He turned back to Waters. After 33 years, Congresswoman, if your district is worse off, that's not bad luck. That's not Republican obstruction. That's not systemic anything. That's your leadership failure. You've had 33 years. The results speak for themselves. Your constituents are poorer. You're richer. They suffer. You prosper. That's not representation. That's a con that's lasted 3 decades. Kennedy sat down, folded his hands. I have no more questions. I think the evidence speaks for itself. The room sat in stunned silence. Complete, absolute silence. You could hear people breathing. Waters looked like she'd been hit by a truck, her carefully constructed persona demolished, her career in ruins, her corruption exposed, her incompetence revealed, her entire 33-year con laid bare for the world to see. Her attorneys were frantically whispering, but there was nothing to say. No defense against documented facts, no spin that could explain away the evidence, no talking points that could deflect from reality. Democrats on the committee were staring at their desks, unwilling to defend her, unable to dispute the facts, hoping the attention would move somewhere else. Republicans were trying not to smile. This was better than they could have hoped for. Complete destruction of a political opponent using nothing but her own record. And somewhere in South Los Angeles, Waters' constituents were watching, finally seeing what many of them had suspected for years, that their representative didn't represent them, that she'd gotten rich while they'd gotten poorer, that she'd used them as a stepping stone to power and wealth, that she didn't even live among them anymore. The video went viral before the hearing had even ended. Staffers were texting clips to reporters. Media was rushing to cover it. Social media was exploding. Kennedy destroys Maxine Waters was trending worldwide within an hour. By the next morning, the video had 80 million views across all platforms. Not clips, the full 2-hour hearing. People were watching the whole thing. Kennedy's methodical destruction of Waters' career played out like a legal drama, each round building on the last. Each piece of evidence more damning than the one before. CNN tried to frame it as a partisan attack, but their own legal analysts had to admit the evidence was solid. Senator Kennedy presented documentation for every claim. One analyst said reluctantly, "These aren't allegations. These are documented facts from public records." MSNBC brought on defenders of Waters, but they struggled. How do you defend someone living in a $4.5 million mansion while their district suffers in poverty? How do you explain away a daughter making 10 times market rate from the mother's campaigns? How do you justify a district getting worse over 33 years? Even liberal outlets couldn't fully defend her. The Washington Post ran a fact check. Kennedy's claims about Waters' district, family enrichment, and ethics violations are largely accurate. Largely accurate was the best they could do. The real impact came in her district. Within 48 hours, protests erupted outside her Los Angeles office. Not small protests. Hundreds of people, many of them her own constituents. Signs read, 33 years of failure. Move back to South LA. Our poverty, your mansion. Fire Maxine. A community activist who'd supported Waters for years gave an interview that went viral. We've been loyal to her for decades. We defended her when Republicans attacked her. But Senator Kennedy laid out facts we can't ignore. She doesn't live here anymore. She's gotten rich while we've gotten poorer. Her daughter makes millions from campaigns. We can't defend this anymore. The House Ethics Committee, which had been sitting on complaints against Waters for years, suddenly announced a new investigation. Under pressure from the viral video and public outrage, they couldn't ignore it anymore. They'd review the one united matter, the family enrichment, the earmark patterns. Everything Kennedy had documented. More significantly, a primary challenger emerged within a week. A young progressive Democrat from South LA announced she'd challenge Waters. Her entire campaign was built on Kennedy's presentation. 33 years of failure. Time for new leadership that lives in the district, understands the district, and will fight for the district. The polls were devastating for Waters. In her own district, her approval dropped to 47%. For the first time in decades, she was underwater with her own constituents. When asked if they'd prefer new leadership, 61% said yes. Her fellow Congressional Black Caucus members distanced themselves. They couldn't be seen defending corruption, especially corruption so thoroughly documented. Some privately said what they couldn't say publicly. Kennedy was right. Waters had been getting away with it for too long. The appropriations she'd controlled started drying up. Organizations that had hired Karen suddenly announced they were going in a different direction with their consulting. The pay-to-play scheme Kennedy exposed had become too hot to touch. Karen Waters' consulting business collapsed. Organizations that had paid her inflated fees stopped calling. Politicians who'd hired her to get Maxine's endorsement found other consultants. The money pipeline Kennedy documented shut down almost overnight. Waters herself became toxic. Speaking fees disappeared. Organizations that had paid her $20,000 per speech found other speakers. The media appearances she'd craved became scarce. Networks didn't want to give airtime to someone who'd just been exposed so thoroughly. But perhaps the most symbolic moment came 3 months after the hearing. A for sale sign went up outside her Hancock Park mansion. She was selling. The speculation was that she couldn't afford it anymore. Not without the consulting fees to Karen. Not with her political career in jeopardy. Or maybe she finally got the message. That living in luxury while representing poverty was indefensible. Either way, the mansion that symbolized her disconnect from constituents was going on the market. Kennedy's point had hit home. The primary election 6 months later wasn't even close. Waters lost by 19 points, 19, to a challenger who'd never held office, who had a tenth of Waters' campaign money, who had none of her name recognition. But that challenger had something Waters didn't. She lived in the district, understood the district, hadn't spent 33 years enriching herself while constituents suffered. On election night, Waters gave a bitter concession speech. She blamed Republicans, blamed racism, blamed outside interference. She never once acknowledged what Kennedy had documented, that she'd failed her constituents for 3 decades while enriching herself and her family. Kennedy was asked about it during a press conference, was characteristically modest. I just asked questions and presented facts from public records. If that's controversial, if that's considered a partisan attack, maybe the problem isn't the questions. Maybe the problem is the conduct. Someone asked if he felt responsible for ending her career. Kennedy smiled that Louisiana smile. I didn't end her career. Her record ended her career. I just made sure people saw it. All I did was shine a light. The roaches scattered when the light came on. That's not my fault. That's their nature. The hearing became required viewing in political science classes. The Kennedy-Waters hearing was analyzed for its effectiveness, its use of evidence, its methodical structure. Professors used it to teach students about accountability, about how to present evidence. about the importance of documentation. But for ordinary Americans, especially those over 60 who'd watched career politicians enrich themselves for decades, it was simpler than that. They'd watched a Louisiana lawyer with a slow drawl systematically destroy a career politician with her own record. No tricks, no spin, just facts and receipts. Maxine Waters had spent 33 years building power, accumulating wealth, avoiding accountability. It took John Kennedy one hearing to bring it all down, because he'd done something radical in modern politics. He'd held a powerful person accountable using evidence and facts. The message echoed far beyond that hearing room. Career politicians who enrich themselves while constituents suffer, who violate ethics rules without consequences, who hold power through seniority rather than merit. Their time was running out. Someone was watching, someone was documenting, someone had receipts, and sometimes that someone has a Louisiana drawl and a legal pad full of evidence. Senator Kennedy did what journalists should have done decades ago. He investigated Maxine Waters and presented the evidence of her corruption and incompetence in a way that couldn't be ignored or spun away. 33 years of enriching herself while constituents suffered. $1 million to her daughter from campaign funds. Ethics violations for helping her husband's bank. A mansion outside her district while constituents live in poverty. Inflammatory rhetoric that incites violence. Fundamental ignorance about the industries she regulates. Family enrichment schemes funded by taxpayers. Kennedy exposed it all with that Louisiana charm and those devastating receipts. He didn't yell. He didn't insult. He just presented fact after fact, document after document, showing exactly who Maxine Waters is and what she's done with 33 years in power. After 33 years of failure, Maxine Waters lost her seat. Her constituents finally got the representation they deserve. Someone who actually represents them instead of exploiting them. The receipts don't lie. Kennedy brought all of them, and career politicians everywhere are nervous, wondering if they're next. Because if someone digs into their records the way Kennedy dug into Waters's, what will they find? Probably exactly what Kennedy found in that folder. Decades of corruption that thrived in darkness until someone finally turned on the light.